Welcome to Shift, a college admissions ACT and SAT podcast for a changing world. I'm Tyler, the founder of Achievable, and we have an affordable ACT course that includes everything you need to ace your ACT. A full textbook, tons of ACT questions backed by our memory-enhancing algorithm, videos on key topics, a built-in study planner, and full-length practice exams. You can get a free trial by going to achievable.me, and if you like it, the code podcast will get you 10% off at checkout. Now, let's get started. Today, we have Linus Law and Mollie Book with us for a special episode. Linus is actually a student, and then Mollie is a teacher. So I'd love to let them introduce themselves here, and then we can get on with the topic. So Linus, do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Linus Law. I'm a senior at Phillips Academy, Andover, and I've been working and learning about dyslexia through certain internships over the summer, and I'm also planning a walkathon in the spring to raise money for dyslexia organizations and other learning difficulties.
Fantastic. And Mollie?
Yeah, my name's Molly. I am currently a middle school English teacher at a private school in New York. I have a background in English education, and when I graduated from undergrad, started working in a school with high schoolers, and they could not read, and it was very difficult for me to figure out how to teach students how to read. So that led to me getting a master's from Teachers College at Columbia as a reading specialist, and I now work full time as a special education teacher. And it's great. I love it. Thanks for having us, Tyler.
Yeah, absolutely. So this call is really, like both of you kind of alluded to, right? We're here to talk about how to overcome learning disabilities such as dyslexia or ADHD and other ones that are, ever more prominent nowadays, when you're preparing for standardized tests. And so, Linus, if you could just start us off kind of talking a little bit about just your experience and kind of the premise for all of this, that would be great.
Yeah, so I took the SAT last year, and studying for the SAT was kind of really stressful, because there's the first of all the time limit, right? It's really difficult to get through all the sections, read everything, process everything, right? And as I learned more about dyslexia and other reading difficulties, I realized that you know, I already had so much stress, and I'm neurotypical, but for people with dyslexia, for students with dyslexia, um, the stress would be just so much more. And so I wanted to try to set up something to help other students, and especially students with those learning difficulties, to better prepare for these tests and have a little bit of a load off their shoulders.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you can, when you're preparing for the SAT or the ACT, potentially get special accommodations, which we're not going to dig into today. We actually cover that in other episodes of this podcast. But even with those, you're still, climbing up a steeper hill than everybody else who's already in your, like you said, even as a neurotypical person, these tests are not easy, right?
Hmm.
So it's a very like big challenge for these people, both on the actual test taking test day side, and then also what you can't get study accommodations for is the studying, right? You actually need to be able to prepare for these tests even though you have these learning disabilities, and that can be super hard too. um Mollie, yeah, I think maybe just coming from your experience, let's start with dyslexia, right? Like, what are some of the, just in your, from what you know, like the best tactics or things that you can do if you are dyslexic to help both just reading in general, but then also like preparing for standardized tests where the detail of the words, order of the words, and other things like grammar and punctuation are very specific.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways, depending on a student's profile and what they prefer, in terms of coming at dyslexia in general. In terms of studying, especially for something like a standardized test, unfortunately, standardized tests, they're they're that necessary evil, right? And
Hmm.
it is not structured in a way that fits neurodivergent brains, right? I mean, you can look at a lot of CEOs. I mean, Barbara Corcoran, Mark Ruffalo, like Richard Branson. These are people who all have dyslexia. They are exceptionally brilliant. But a test like this doesn't always capture that. So, I think Linus, you mentioned it as well. Time, just with how their brains are wired, it's not that fast paced neural circuit. They need to kind of create their own neural pathways, which takes a lot more time. So I think the first and foremost, if you do not have the accommodation for double time or time and a half, um, you need to start thinking about what timing is going to look like studying wise. If you have a learning difference, then you might need to be start your study process 6 months before everyone else. Um,
Hmm.
that's just going to be the name of the game.
Yeah, and then when you're doing the study itself, right? I mean, I think part of the challenge here is just like the studying part, right? I think once you get through the studying, you know the game you have to play to do well in the test. But do you have any tips for the studying and studying particularly the reading or writing or English sections, depending on which test you're on?
Yeah, definitely. So, something I always recommend, especially with vocab, right? Vocab is a huge part of that. Um, you know, I mean, first of all, if you can read more if you can. But, studying etymology and morphology, if you approach things with knowing the definitions of certain Latin and Greek roots, prefixes, suffixes, if you come across an unfamiliar word, if you have a general idea of what sub means or chrono means, then that can kind of help you as far as comprehension of the word. That always seems to be a good strategy. Image association, I find, is often really helpful. So, if you're reading and you actively reading, you want to stop and actually picture it in your head. Um, Having those mental associations can really be helpful in that visual piece. Um, and, I think in general, anything multisensory is key. And so,
Hmm.
even for someone like me, I'm diagnosed with ADHD. And before studying for some of my tests, moving, like kinesthetic moving, really helped. It was just studying that information with some sort of novel activity or doing some sort of movement helped me recall that information in the moment on the test. So I remember studying for
Hmm.
a test and I had laminated flashcards, and I would look at a flashcard, swim a lap, and come back and like recite it to myself. And as wild as it sounds, I mean, that stuck in my head. So if you're moving, like walk around, I know very often people have this designated study space. Like I'm always going to sit at my desk. It's going to be a quiet space. I actually don't think that works well for everyone, especially if you're neurodivergent. Moving around, doing something a little different, you will start to um, make those associations based on the place that you're at. So, switching up routine, moving around if you can, if you're musically inclined, turning it into, song. I mean, any of those things can really help with your memory in terms of vocabulary specifically. But
Huh. Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, what for people that maybe, I think laminated flashcards is maybe a more investment than people are willing to make into this. I, uh, I mean, do you recommend like trying to take your flashcards on a walk or like maybe not everybody can really do like a treadmill or a standing desk or that kind of thing because those are kind of expensive. But just like, do you have any recommendations?
yeah, definitely. Doing something on a walk, I mean, that's definitely great. And it doesn't always have to be any sort of movement, right? Even if it was like
Hmm.
in between, or, even something as simple as, okay, I'm, obviously not a math person, but in terms of if you're working through an equation, instead of just looking at it or writing it down, like taking your fingers and drawing it out.
Hmm.
You can do that. I have some students who do that like in, those little Zen gardens. They do that in the
Hmm.
sand, and it's even that sort of touch and feel that all helps. It really does all help.
That's fascinating. So I guess why does it help? Like, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not like a complete expert, but a lot of research shows that a multisensory approach, engaging all of those different senses, it just helps store information in the brain in a better way, right? And especially since,
Hmm.
the way a dyslexic brain is wired, just based on how much time and effort it takes to kind of get to that language part of their brain.
Hmm.
And if you can access any of those other neural pathways, it's going to make things easier for you and it's going to make the information stick.
That's really interesting. So then, how do you recall it on the test day, right? Because you can't go for a swim.
No, no, but it's something like I mean, imagine you sit at your desk
Hmm.
for hours and hours and hours and hours. Um, studying for months and months, and then you get there in the test, and you're still sitting there at this quiet desk doing this thing. Um, you know, it's almost like this muscle memory, and being in that novel situation. I mean, novelty is wonderful for learning material and retaining information. So, going back to my own example of swimming laps, um, it was it was just easier. It's hard to explain that movement. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that day I did all those laps. That was the day I studied this section in particular. And so when I got to that section of the test, I remembered that lap pool, and that stuff came back to me a little faster. So just
Right.
again, switching up as much as you can, doing one section, doing this activity, one section, doing that activity. It so when you're in the test, it's not like you're thinking back on months and months of sitting in the same place. You could be like, okay, I remember working on this strategy when I was sitting in a park, um,
Right.
and kind of differentiating it that way.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question is, is it different types of activities or is it that you're in different places, right? Like, would you recommend, I only go to the park to study this section and I only go to my school library to study this section, like some doing that kind of approach?
I mean, I think that's something that just depends on the person. So I mean, you could certainly do it that way. But I think in general, from my experience with many of my students, sticking to too much structure can feel a little overwhelming, and not as helpful. So I think ultimately, and again, this is why time and starting early is important, because there's going to be a process of figuring out what is most helpful. Um, yeah.
Great. And so from there, excuse me. And so from there, what do you feel like is kind of the next tip that you would give, right? I feel like that was a really good tip. Do you have other sort of advice for people during the prep process?
Yeah. So, and I think this is probably for anyone in general, any student, but just really understanding the structure of these tests, really, essentially knowing how to take a test. Anything that can help you shortcut a little bit. So if, especially with like the reading passages, if you know what types of passages they'll be giving, if you can quickly glance at the text structure, and then, your brain can think, okay, if this is, something, I'm going to think about author's purpose. So just learning like how to take the test, and having that really memorized so you don't need to worry and spend any cognitive load during the test figuring out what's going on. Um, I think that's
Right.
key.
Yeah. And I mean, particularly with, like the ACT English and, the SAT equivalent, right? A lot of times they're testing you on, you know, grammar and punctuation and sentence structure, which is something that dyslexia people, struggle with, right? Because order of operations and things like that. What do you recommend for people when they're both like studying for those types of questions and also taking them on the test?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can speak a little bit to the structure, especially with certain sentences. Very often explicitly teach my students to look out for certain types of transition words. So, for example, if it says although or even though, training them to think, all right, I automatically have to think of a contradiction. So, what answers can I automatically eliminate based on the structure of the sentence? So, like those keywords, like those transition words, um, I think just under like picking those out and understanding what the question is asking can be really helpful
Hmm.
in the moment. You might be able to eliminate two of your answer choices at that point if you understand if it's asking for, if it's elaborating or if it's contradicting. Um, but in terms of mechanics, punctuation, that sort of thing, I have to be honest, it's something that we're still grammar's hard. And I feel like I
Hmm.
grew up in the 90s. Grammar was not taught. It was just this, it'll happen. And it doesn't always happen for everyone, dyslexic or not.
Hmm.
Those are just little pieces. I think it's just a lot of repetition. It's just a lot of repetition. I have yet to find a really fun way to teach commas and that sort of thing.
Right.
So, and again, I think part of that too is, if you're studying and listening to an audiobook, still track along with the text so you can at least be familiar with the structure and what that looks like. I think just exposure to that can help. But at the end of the day, that's always going to be difficult. And that's the hard piece with this is just the way school is structured, the way these tests are structured. It's so antiquated in so many ways, and it's not necessarily modeled for brains that work this way. And so it's very hard. But my message to my students is always that, it's not a reflection on them. It's just a reflection of
Hmm.
the society we're in.
Hmm.
But in the meantime,
Right.
spell check is great, but a lot of practice is necessary.
Yeah, and like really memorizing the rules, right? Like I think that so many of these grammar things are just knowing the rules and the exceptions and knowing which one goes where.
Yeah.
And yeah. So you mentioned there, as you were talking, you talked about audio.
Hmm.
I thought that was interesting. So do you recommend also that students with these kind of neurodivergences try or use at simultaneously multiple teaching methods, essentially, right? You could it's, text, audio, video. I'm not really sure if there's any more than that for this kind of subject matter. Do you recommend switching them around, or do you have any recommendations for like, do you want them to read while they listen to the audiobook, or anything like that? Like anything that you recommend to help?
Yeah, 100%. Yes, huge fan of audiobooks. I often have people come up to me like, "Isn't that cheating?" I'm like, "No, it's not cheating." But if for students with dyslexia, especially if it's in an academic setting, a study setting, tracking along with a physical book is really important because it's still important to like get used to sentence structure and again those mechanic pieces, hearing a word and then seeing the word. That's only going to help getting those different modalities in. But audiobooks are really helpful because it's taking some of that cognitive load and effort off of the student. And typically, students with dyslexia are exceptionally bright. And so if you can alleviate some of that weight of decoding on their own and they can listen while they're studying, they're going to access so much more because some of that effort has been taken from them.
Right. Well, and I also think that do you feel like it's accurate for me to say that if you're reading something and listening to it, and it can help kind of undo the dyslexia that's happening from your reading because you can listen to it and you know how it's coming out correctly?
I mean, it certainly helps, right? It helps to, and that's why we ask our students, I ask my students to track just so they can see that. Um, but as far as like undo, I don't know if undo is a word I would use because it's just always
Right.
going to be there. It's just how their brains are. But it does help, right? Exposure and repetition and seeing all those things. That's only going to continue to strengthen those neural pathways. The truth of the matter is that it might always be more effortful, but again, that exposure and seeing those words over time, it gets easier.
Right.
Yeah.
Very cool. So before we move on to kind of more of a focus on ADHD, do you have any other final kind of dyslexia tips?
Um, I know reading is not everyone's favorite, right? And so often we avoid the things that we don't like. Um,
Hmm.
so listen to audiobooks. I tell my students, reading in your own time is so important. You have so much more access to vocabulary, story structure. And so, download Libby or Audible. That counts as reading. That still helps. So if you're, commuting or doing something like laundry, having that in the background still counts. So that's always my recommendation.
Great. Yeah, so then let's switch gears to talk a little bit about ADHD. I mean, I think a lot of the tips that you gave earlier about like moving and like being like trying to kind of associate like what you're studying with like an activity would also help with ADD, ADHD students. Is that correct?
100%. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so is is that because you're your brain's occupied? Like why is that work?
Why does it work for an ADHD brain? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Like, is it because you're keeping half your brain busy doing something like swimming? Is that kind of how it works, or is yeah,
Um, that's a good question. Um,
yeah. You're also not a psychologist, so it's okay
no,
if you don't
no.
know.
I mean, I definitely, in terms of like the brain, definitely know a little more in terms of dyslexia. And often, there's comorbidity with ADHD and a lot of these learning differences. Um,
Mhm.
but I think because, you know, someone with ADHD, and again, that's a spectrum, right? So, you know, um, I am high functioning, so I went a long time without being diagnosed, but it's moving and changing things up keeps me engaged longer. And so I think
Mhm.
that's just going to be key is if you're changing things up, that's going to help with your focus because it's interesting. So, and that's the thing with an ADHD brain, it's like stimulate me, like I need to be stimulated. So any way that you can do that
Mhm.
for yourself is helpful.
And do you feel like the novelty is helpful? Like you mentioned novelty earlier, but so should I be trying to do a different physical activity every week, or is it good enough to just take different walks? Like what sort of
Yeah,
yeah.
different walks for sure. I mean, if I'm working on something in particular, I do public speaking, in my own time. And, there's a park near my apartment. And every time I walk through my park, there are little different things that happen that kind of make it novel for me.
Right.
So, seeing a certain type of dog or, watching a couple argue on the bench, like those are novel things that happen that kind of make it an interesting experience for me. But mental associations really work well for me. That visual association kind of brings me back to the moment. But again, it might not work for everyone. So I just suggest trying different things and seeing what works for you.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, then, for any sort of other than what we've already covered, any specific tips for getting focused enough to study when you're, ADHD,
Yeah,
even if it's from your personal experience, right?
yeah, breaks. I often feel like there's still so much shame around these things, these diagnoses,
Hmm.
and it's frustrating because it's like some of the most brilliant and successful people. Like seriously, if you Google anybody with ADHD and dyslexia, I mean, you're going to see tons of incredible people, and yet there's still this shame. And so growing up for me especially, it's like I felt like I had to punish myself to be like everyone else. It's like, no, you have to do it this
Uh-huh.
way, you have to do it this way, keep going. And so kind of accepting, once I was diagnosed, accepting that I thrived from breaks. It's like, no, I can take a 5 to 10 minute break every hour or so. That's okay. It's fine to
Right.
need that break. Um, I think very often we're very hard on ourselves because we compare to other people, and it's just detrimental in the long run. So have some grace for yourself. Definitely break it up, and don't don't be ashamed that your studying routine looks a lot different than someone else's.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds almost like you're talking about like the Pomodoro method. Have you heard of that?
The what? Sorry.
Pomodoro method, or it's
I've heard of
something
it.
similar
I'm
to
not
that.
super familiar with it, but
Yeah, I mean, the rough idea is like, and there are people that have made YouTube videos for this and stuff, but basically it's that you do, either 25 or 55 minutes of work and then you have a 5-minute break.
mhm.
And you like do that as like a system,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I also wonder when we're talking about prep, is there anything that can kind of help make it interesting to go back and like redo and re-review the stuff that you got wrong, right? Because I mean, if you're studying something for the first time, it can often be interesting, but if you're kind of going over it for the third or fourth time, it can get pretty boring, right? So any sort of tips for that or anything to make that more fun?
Uh, that's a great question. I think sometimes
Mhm.
things are just boring for
Yeah,
anybody. You know what I mean? Dyslexic or not, and that's an unfortunate piece. I think just the nature of these tests is part of it is just doing it. But
right.
I mean, honestly, and this might just be maybe this is just me, and this is just being silly, but anytime like when especially when I was studying vocabulary and going back on words that really just I got stuck on using them in sentences that were incredibly ridiculous, like like over the top, really silly, like how insane can I make this sentence? Guaranteed after I was laughing and wrote that, even as inappropriate as it may have been, I never forgot that word, right? So if you're
Right.
studying, give yourself permission to take it lightly. I know there's so much seriousness around this, but that's only going to increase your anxiety. So if you can, like, have a little fun with it, feel free to have a little fun.
Yeah, no, that I like that tip a lot actually, because if you do something ridiculous, first off, writing your own sentence with the vocab word is just a good idea anyway.
Yeah.
That's a good way to remember them. But if you keep saying, the dog, uh, I don't know, the dog jumped over the brown cat, and then you have like, vocab words in place of the word jumped. I mean, maybe it won't really help you as much, or it won't be as memorable. So doing something absurd,
Right.
I really like that idea a lot.
Right.
And yeah, it's just
We like the word egregious, and me and a friend going back and forth and trying to think of the most egregious, like, silly act that someone could commit, and now it's just that's part of my vocabulary now because I remember that moment. And I guess that's another piece too, in just saying that if you can talk through something with another person, if you have
right,
someone with you, that's going to be so helpful. So whether that's a tutor or a friend, someone you trust,
right.
that can
Yeah,
be really
study
helpful
buddy.
too. Yeah, study buddies really do make a difference.
I like the study buddy suggestion a lot because certainly, if you are, ADD, or frankly, even if you're a normal person, like it's easy to get distracted, right? So if you have someone else there with you and they're doing the same thing, you can kind of keep each other accountable
Yeah.
and make it so it's like, yeah, we're both here to study. Like we can be on our phones later. Like let's do this,
Right, right.
right?
Yeah. And verbally processing, I think for many students with ADHD and dyslexia, processing things verbally can be really helpful. So having a partner there to do that with is really great.
Yeah. Yeah, I like all that advice. So then the last thing I want to talk about today is, on test day,
Hmm.
right? When you're taking the SAT or the ACT, even if so I mean, sometimes you can get special accommodations and then you have more time, which is great. It's a big advantage. But it also means, regardless, at a minimum, you're spending, for the ACT, like 3 hours, 45 minutes. The new SAT is 2 hours. I bet you there will be a new ACT at some point that's shorter too. But if you get extended time, it's going to be even longer than that, right? Like it could be 5, 6 hours. That's a long time to concentrate. Most students, regardless of their neurotypicalness, take 1 hour tests at most, right? So now you're taking at least a 2 hour test up to like a 6 hour test, depending on which one it is and whether you got extra time. How do you manage all of that, right? You get some breaks, but they're pretty few and far between.
Yeah. So generally, if a student has um, a diagnosis and they have an accommodation, right? They're legally mandated to have that accommodation. So generally, with something like time and a half or double time, there are other pieces that go into that. And so often that's extra breaks. So,
Okay.
a few breaks every 30 minutes or something of that sort. Because otherwise, 5 hours straight, I mean, that's inhumane. But, outside of that, and this, is a suggestion that I think most students groan at, but I swear by it, is learning some meditation techniques and breathing techniques,
Yep.
just to like refocus and to some extent like tapping back into your body. Um, you know, you have a limited range of movement on test day. So if you can kind of be aware of small movements with your body, even if it's like shoulder rolls or neck rolls, certain breathing exercises, not only will that calm you, but it's helping you kind of like move your body a bit. So
Right.
I think that's important to practice, and that's another thing you have to practice. Meditation's not easy, but even just like basic breathing practices can be really helpful and bring you back into the moment.
Yeah, and really helpful for test anxiety too, right? Which is something that I think a lot of people who have these learning disabilities also experience. And yeah, I understand why you said that, but if you're a high school student listening to this and you think it's kind of silly to do meditation, they actually have proven in psychology studies that people that meditate score better on the tests, right? So all you have to do is learn how to, take deep breaths for 30 seconds and you can get a higher score and maybe get to go to the college you want to go to. That's pretty easy, right? It's a lot easier than becoming, a D1 swimmer or whatever it is.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And
I
that's a
think,
skill that you will take anywhere you go, right? I mean, I don't remember the
mhm.
math equations I did in my SAT, but those breathing techniques can help in any situation. So it's only going to help you in the long run.
Yeah, exactly. Well, great. Any sort of parting thoughts here before we wrap up?
um yeah, I mean, I think just, and maybe this is a little cheesy, but a lot of my students and friends that I know who have these differences, again, just speaking back to that shame, I think we place
Mhm.
a lot of our identity and feelings of success in these things. And yes, this is important. And yes, it is an indicator of what is to come. And it plays a part in that. Um, but I just always try to remind my students that it is a part of who they are. It is not who they are. And just
Mhm.
thinking like holistically that their brains work in such beautiful ways that are not captured on this test in particular. So to not remember to place all of their eggs in this little standardized test basket, that they are a multifaceted person. This is just one piece of that puzzle. So, you know, the world is a better place because these neurodivergent brains are in it. So
Mhm.
keep on keeping on. Everyone's doing really well. Keep it up.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been Shift, a college admissions podcast for a changing world, hosted by Tyler from Achievable with Linus Law from Phillips Academy Andover and Mollie Book. And Achievable has a ACT course that you can try for free by visiting achievable.me. And if you like it, be sure to use the code podcast to get 10% off.